58 years old now, and for 23 years I've been carrying a secret that's changed everything about how I see the world and my place in it. My name is David Castellano, and I used to be a commercial airline pilot. I flew for Western Pacific Airlines for 11 years before November 2001, logging over 8,000 flight hours without a single incident worth reporting. I had a spotless record, a wife, 2 daughters, and a career I'd worked my entire adult life to build. All of that ended on a single night over Montana, though it took me months to understand what had actually happened, and years to accept that I would never be able to prove it to anyone who mattered. What I'm about to tell you isn't speculation or fantasy. It's what happened to me on November 14th, 2001, and what I learned during the 6 hours I spent aboard something that shouldn't exist according to everything we're taught about reality. I've thought about sharing the story for over 2 decades, weighing whether the relief of finally speaking would be worth the consequences. I've written it down and deleted it dozens of times. I've started conversations with my wife and stopped before the words could form. But staying silent has become harder than the fear of what happens when I stop. The truth is, I know what they do to people on those ships. I've seen it. I've experienced it. And what haunts me most isn't just what happened to me. It's knowing that it's still happening, that it's happened to thousands of others, and that most of them either don't remember or have been made to believe their memories are just dreams or psychological breaks. I need to tell this exactly as it occurred, without embellishment or attempts to make it more believable. If you choose not to believe me, I understand. I wouldn't have believed it either before it happened. But this is my testimony, and after 23 years of silence, I owe it to the others I saw that night to at least try to tell the truth. November 14th, 2001, I reported for duty at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 10:47 p.m. for Flight 2817 to Denver International Airport. It was a routine red-eye that I'd flown dozens of times before, a 3-hour flight over the Cascades, across Idaho and Montana, with arrival scheduled for 4:30 a.m. Mountain Time. The weather forecast was clear, minimal turbulence expected, light passenger load of 73 people in our Boeing 737-300. My co-pilot was Sarah Chen, 31 years old, sharp and competent with about 2,000 hours of flight time. We'd flown together maybe 15 times before. Professional relationship, easy communication in the cockpit. Pre-flight checks were normal. We pushed back from the gate at 11:52 p.m., 12 minutes ahead of schedule. Tower cleared us for takeoff at 12:04 a.m., and we lifted off without incident. I remember the lights of Seattle falling away beneath us as we climbed to our cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. Sarah handled the radio communications while I managed the flight controls. By 12:35 a.m., we'd leveled off and engaged the autopilot. The cabin lights were dimmed, most passengers already asleep. It was shaping up to be one of those flights where nothing memorable happens, the kind I'd flown hundreds of times before. We crossed into Montana airspace at approximately 1:47 a.m. I remember checking our position. We were over the Bitterroot Range, about 40 miles southwest of Missoula. The night was perfectly clear, no cloud cover, visibility unlimited. I could see stars through the cockpit windows with unusual clarity. Sarah had just gotten up to use the restroom, leaving me alone at the controls for what should have been a routine few minutes. That's when the instrument started malfunctioning. It began with the compass, which suddenly began spinning clockwise, slowly at first, then faster. I tapped the glass, thinking it was a mechanical issue, but it continued rotating. Then the altimeter began fluctuating, 37,000 feet, 36,800, 37,200 dropping, and rising without any corresponding change in our actual altitude that I could feel. The autopilot disengaged without warning, and I heard the disconnect alarm. I took manual control, checking our attitude and engine instruments. Everything else appeared normal. Airspeed steady at 490 knots, engines running smoothly, fuel consumption normal. I reached for the radio to contact Denver Center, our air traffic control, but before I could key the mic, every electrical instrument on the panel went dark. Complete failure. The primary flight display, the navigation display, the engine instruments. Everything went black simultaneously. We still had emergency lighting, powered by the backup battery system. But I'd just lost all my primary instruments on a commercial flight over the Rocky Mountains at night. My training kicked in immediately. I knew we had backup instruments, the standby attitude indicator, the magnetic compass, the standby altimeter. I focused on those, maintaining straight and level flight by reference to the horizon, which I could still see clearly through the windscreen. I was about to call back to Sarah when I saw the light. It appeared off our left side, maybe 2 miles distant, at roughly the same altitude. At first I thought it was another aircraft, but the light was wrong. It wasn't the standard red and green navigation lights or the white strobe that all aircraft carry. This was a single, bright white light, completely steady, no blinking or pulsing. And it was moving in a way that made no sense. It approached us from the side, then stopped, hovering motionless relative to our position. We were traveling at 490 knots, over 560 miles per hour, and this thing matched our speed instantly and held position. I felt my heart rate increase. I'd heard stories from other pilots about unusual lights, objects that didn't behave like conventional aircraft, but I'd always dismissed them as misidentifications or exaggerations. Now I was watching something that violated every principle of aerodynamics I understood. No aircraft could accelerate that quickly and match speed without any visible means of propulsion. There were no engine sounds, no exhaust, no wings or tail surfaces I could make out, just that single, impossibly bright light. The object began moving closer. It crossed the distance between us in seconds, taking up a position maybe 500 feet off our left wing. That's when I got my first clear look at it, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a light. It was an object, roughly triangular in shape, with the light emanating from its entire underside. The thing was massive, easily twice the wingspan of our 737. The surface appeared metallic, but it didn't reflect light the way metal should. It seemed to absorb the starlight, creating a darker patch against the night sky. Sarah came back into the cockpit. I heard her gasp behind me. "What is that?" she said, her voice tight. I didn't answer because I didn't know. I was still trying to process what I was seeing. The object maintained perfect formation with us, not drifting an inch despite the fact that we were moving through the air at over 500 miles per hour. There was no turbulence from its presence, no wake, no downdraft, nothing that should happen when two large objects fly that close together. I reached for the radio again, intending to declare an emergency, to report what we were seeing to air traffic control. My hand was on the transmit button when the light from the object intensified, becoming so bright that I had to squint. Then everything went white, and I lost all sense of where I was. The next thing I remember clearly is sitting in the cockpit with my hands on the yoke and the sound of tower communication crackling through my headset. A voice was calling our flight number, sounding urgent. "Western Pacific 2817, Great Falls Tower. Do you copy? We show you on our runway without clearance. Respond immediately." I keyed the mic, confused. "Great Falls Tower, this is Western Pacific 2817. Say again your last." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hoarse and uncertain. I looked at Sarah. She was in her seat staring straight ahead, her hands in her lap. Her face was pale, expression blank. Western Pacific 2817. You are on the ground at Great Falls International Airport. We have emergency vehicles en route to your position. Are you experiencing an emergency? I looked out the windscreen. We were on a runway, completely stationary, engines at idle. The airport lights stretched out around us. I had no memory of descending, no memory of landing, no memory of anything between seeing that object and this moment. I checked the chronometer on my watch. It read 4:53 a.m. Nearly 3 hours had passed. We should have been landing in Denver. Instead, we were on the ground in Great Falls, Montana, roughly 200 miles north of where we'd been when I last had clear memory. Negative emergency, I said, though I had no idea if that was true. Request instructions for taxi. They guided us to a gate. I went through the motions of shutting down the engines, running the post-flight checklist, but my hands were shaking. Sarah hadn't spoken since I'd regained awareness. When I asked if she was okay, she turned to look at me with an expression I'll never forget. Complete confusion, mixed with something that looked like terror she was trying to suppress. I don't remember landing, she said quietly. Dave, I don't remember anything after we leveled off at cruise altitude. The airport manager met us at the gate along with 2 FAA officials and local law enforcement. The questions started immediately. Why had we diverted to Great Falls? Why hadn't we communicated our intentions? Why had we landed without requesting clearance? I tried to explain what I'd seen, the object off our wing, the light, the sudden gap in memory, but the words sounded insane even to me. The FAA officials exchanged glances that told me exactly what they thought. Pilot incapacitation, possible medical event, maybe drugs or alcohol. They took us to separate rooms for interviews. I spent 4 hours going over every detail I could remember, which wasn't much. Yes, all pre-flight checks were normal. Yes, I'd been well rested. No, I hadn't consumed alcohol in the past 48 hours. No, I wasn't on any medications. Yes, the instruments had malfunctioned. No, I didn't know why. They asked about the object I'd reported seeing. I described it as accurately as I could. The triangular shape, the light, the way it had matched our speed. The official, taking my statement, wrote it down without comment, his face professionally neutral. They conducted immediate drug and alcohol tests. Both came back clean. They ordered medical evaluations. The doctor found nothing unusual except for my elevated heart rate and blood pressure, which he attributed to stress. But then he noticed something. You have a mark here, he said, touching the skin behind my left ear. Recent abrasion, maybe a day or 2 old. I touched the spot. It was tender, slightly raised, about the size of a pencil eraser. I had no memory of injuring myself there. The doctor made a note in his chart but didn't seem particularly concerned. Probably bumped it on something, he said. Sarah's examination showed nothing unusual. Her blood work was clean. But her account matched mine in one critical way. She had no memory of the descent or landing either. The last thing she clearly remembered was using the restroom, then returning to the cockpit and seeing something bright outside. After that, nothing until we were on the ground in Great Falls. They grounded us both pending investigation. The passengers were interviewed, but most had been asleep and noticed nothing unusual. A few mentioned waking up when the plane landed, surprised to be at a different airport than expected, but none reported seeing anything strange outside the windows. Our flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were pulled for analysis. I was told the results would take several weeks. I flew home to Seattle the next day on a commercial flight as a passenger. My wife, Linda, picked me up from the airport. She'd been frantic with worry after the airline called to inform her of the incident. I tried to explain what had happened, but I couldn't make sense of it even to myself. Some kind of instrument malfunction, I told her. They're investigating. I'm sure it'll be cleared up soon. But I wasn't sure, because that night, lying in bed in my own house, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of things I couldn't quite grasp. Bright light, metal walls, a sense of being moved, of lying on something hard and cold. Sounds that weren't quite sounds, more like vibrations I could feel in my bones. And faces, not human faces, something else. The images were fragmentary, like trying to remember a dream, hours after waking, but they felt more real than dreams. They felt like memories forcing their way through some barrier in my mind. The nightmares started 3 days after the incident. I'd fall asleep and immediately find myself back in the cockpit, watching that triangular object pace our aircraft. But in the dreams, I remembered what happened next, the light intensifying until it filled my entire field of vision. A sensation of floating, of being separated from my body. Looking down and seeing the cockpit below me, seeing Sarah slumped in her seat, seeing myself motionless at the controls. Then movement, rapid and disorienting, as if I was being pulled through the wall of the aircraft without the wall being there. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be having a heart attack. Linda would ask what was wrong, and I'd tell her it was just stress from the investigation, anxiety about potentially losing my license. I couldn't tell her the truth because I didn't know what the truth was. Were these actual memories, or was my mind creating false narratives to fill in the gaps? I'd read about confabulation, the way the brain invents memories to make sense of missing time. Maybe that's all this was, but the dreams became more detailed, more consistent. After 2 weeks, I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I remembered immediately upon waking. The entries were fragmentary at first, disconnected images and sensations. White walls that seemed to glow from within. A sense of pressure, of being unable to move my arms or legs, though nothing visible restrained me. Beings moving around me. I couldn't see them clearly, just shapes at the periphery of my vision, but I knew they were there. And sounds, or what my brain interpreted as sounds. High-pitched tones that seemed to resonate directly in my skull. 3 weeks after the incident, I had a dream that was different from the others. It was longer, more coherent, and when I woke up I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't a dream at all. It was memory, surfacing through whatever had been done to suppress it. I remembered being in a room. The walls were seamless, white or possibly silver, with no visible joints or seams. The light came from everywhere at once, diffuse and shadowless. I was lying on a platform, my body positioned flat on my back. I tried to move but couldn't. Not because I was strapped down, there were no physical restraints, but because my muscles simply wouldn't respond to my commands. I could move my eyes, could breathe, could swallow, but everything else was locked in place by some force I couldn't understand. There were others in the room. I use the word others because being seems too vague and aliens carries too much cultural baggage, too many preconceptions from science fiction. But they weren't human. I could see 3 of them clearly. They were shorter than average humans, maybe 4.5 feet tall, with thin bodies and disproportionately large heads. The skin was grayish, smooth with no visible hair. The eyes were large, dark, and completely black. No whites, no irises that I could distinguish. They moved with precise, economical gestures, no wasted motion. They didn't speak, at least not in any way I could hear. But I understood what they wanted. It was like having thoughts appear in my mind that weren't my own thoughts. Not words exactly, but concepts, intentions. They wanted me to remain calm. They wanted me to not resist. They were going to examine me, and it would be easier if I didn't fight the paralysis. One of them moved closer to the platform. It held something in its hand, a device of some kind, metallic and smooth, about the size of a pen. It brought the device close to my head, positioning it near my left temple. I felt a vibration, deep and resonant, that seemed to pass through my skull and into my brain. Not painful, but profoundly uncomfortable. The sensation of something foreign moving through the tissue of my mind. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make my vocal cords work. I could only lie there while they continued their examination. The device moved to different positions around my head, temples, forehead, behind the ears. Each time, that same deep vibration, that sense of intrusion. I realized they weren't just scanning me. They were accessing something, reading something. My thoughts, my memories, the electrical patterns of my consciousness itself. The examination lasted, I don't know how long. Time felt distorted in that room, stretched and compressed simultaneously. It might have been minutes or hours. Eventually, they moved away from the platform, and I felt the paralysis begin to fade. I could move my fingers, then my hands, then my arms. I sat up slowly, my head spinning with vertigo. That's when I saw the other room. Through an opening in the wall, I hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps it hadn't been there before. I could see into an adjacent chamber. This room was larger, dimmer, with what looked like dozens of vertical transparent cylinders, arranged in rows, and inside each cylinder was a human being. I stood up from the platform, unsteady on my feet. None of the beings tried to stop me as I moved toward the opening. I don't know if they permitted it or simply didn't care. I stepped through into the observation chamber, and the scale of what I was seeing hit me with physical force. There weren't dozens of cylinders. There were hundreds, extending far beyond what I could see, disappearing into darkness at the edges of the enormous space. Each cylinder contained a person suspended in what appeared to be clear fluid or possibly just air that somehow held them in place. Their eyes were closed, bodies completely still. I moved closer to the nearest cylinder and saw a woman, maybe in her 40s, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Her face was slack, expressionless. I put my hand against the transparent surface of the cylinder. It was warm to the touch, and I could feel a faint vibration, similar to what I'd experienced during my own examination. I moved down the row, looking at face after face. Men, women, different ages, different ethnicities. Some looked peaceful, as if sleeping. Others had expressions of distress frozen on their features. I stopped at a cylinder containing a young man, college-aged, with a tattoo visible on his left forearm. Something about his face was familiar. I'd seen it before, but I couldn't place where. Then I remembered. 2 months earlier, I'd been in a Seattle coffee shop and seen a missing person poster on the bulletin board. The face on that poster matched the face in the cylinder. Derek something, I couldn't recall the last name. Student at University of Washington, disappeared while hiking in the North Cascades. Presumed dead after search and rescue found no trace. But he wasn't dead. He was here, in this impossible place, in a state of suspended awareness. I continued walking, my sense of horror growing with each cylinder I passed. I began recognizing more faces, not people I knew personally, but faces I'd seen on news reports, on missing person databases that my daughter had shown me once when she was doing a school project on unsolved disappearances. A woman who'd vanished from a rest stop in Idaho 3 years ago. A teenager who'd gone missing from a camping trip in Montana. An elderly man I was certain I'd seen on an Amber Alert, though he was too old to be a child now, which meant he'd been here for years, aging in this cylinder while the world searched for him. The rows seemed endless. I walked for what felt like several minutes, passing hundreds of cylinders, and still couldn't see the end of them. These weren't just people taken recently. Some of them had to have been here for years, possibly decades. a systematic collection of human beings maintained in some kind of stasis, their minds accessed and read like files in a database. That's when I understood. This wasn't scientific curiosity. This wasn't aliens studying a primitive species to understand our biology or culture. This was industrial, methodical. They were harvesting us, not our bodies, but our consciousness, our memories, our accumulated experiences. We were resources to them, nothing more significant than the way we might catalog bacteria samples or archive genetic material from endangered species. I felt a presence behind me and turned. One of the beings stood there, watching me with those unreadable black eyes. This one was different from the others I'd seen. Taller, maybe 5 feet, with a slightly different build. And when it looked at me, I felt something I hadn't felt from the others. Not quite emotion, but something approaching it. Recognition. Acknowledgement that I was more than just a specimen to be processed. It didn't touch me, but I felt the same sensation of thoughts appearing in my mind that weren't mine. Concepts forming, understanding flowing into my consciousness. It was showing me something, making me understand. Images appeared in my mind, not like seeing with my eyes, but like remembering something I'd always known. I saw Earth from space, but not from a satellite or spacecraft perspective. I saw it the way they saw it. A resource, a garden they'd been tending for longer than human civilization had existed. I saw human history unfold in rapid succession, but from their perspective. The rise and fall of civilizations, wars, technological development, population growth, and throughout all of it, I saw them, always watching, always taking. Small numbers at first, then more as our population expanded, thousands every year, taken from all over the world. Some returned with their memories suppressed. Others kept in stasis for longer-term observation. And some, I saw this with a clarity that made me want to vomit, never returned at all because they'd served their purpose and were no longer needed. The beings showed me why they did. This. Humans generate consciousness in a way that's unique in their experience. Our combination of self-awareness, imagination, emotional complexity, and abstract reasoning creates patterns in our neural activity that they can extract and utilize. For what purpose, I didn't fully understand. The concepts were too alien, too far beyond my frame of reference. But I understood enough. We were being farmed. Our consciousness itself was the crop. It showed me the scale of the operation. Not just this ship, but others. Dozens of others, operating continuously over centuries. Collection points, all over the planet. Millions of people, taken and returned or taken and kept. The statistics behind missing persons cases, the percentage that are never solved, the ones that get labeled as voluntary disappearances or assumed deaths when no body is found. A significant portion of those weren't accidents or crimes or people starting new lives. They were this. They were harvesting operations that had been ongoing since before recorded history. Then the being showed me something else, and this was worse than everything that had come before. It showed me that they didn't care about our suffering, not because they were cruel, but because our suffering was irrelevant to them. We were no more morally significant to them than cattle are to us, or bacteria in a petri dish. Our emotions, our families, our lives and hopes and dreams, all of it meant nothing. We were just biological machines that produced something they found useful. And finally, it showed me faces. Faces I would recognize. People who'd been taken recently. People who were in the cylinders in this very chamber. It wanted me to know. It wanted me to understand that people I might have known, people from my city, my community, were here. The teenager who'd gone missing from Ballard 3 weeks ago. The hiker who never came back from Mount Rainier. the businessman who vanished from a hotel in Spokane. All here, all harvested. The being stepped back, and I felt the connection break. I was standing in that observation chamber, surrounded by hundreds of harvested humans, with full knowledge of what they were doing to us and full awareness that I could do absolutely nothing about it. Because who would believe me? How could I possibly prove any of this? I was just a pilot who'd experienced missing time and developed false memories to cope with the trauma. That's what any rational person would conclude. Then one of the smaller beings appeared at the opening I'd entered through. It gestured for me to follow. I took one last look at the cylinders, at all those suspended people, and committed their faces to memory as best I could. Then I walked back through the opening into the examination room. The smaller being led me back to the examination platform, but this time I wasn't paralyzed. I could move freely, though I felt no urge to run or fight. Part of me understood that resistance was meaningless here. They controlled the environment completely, controlled my body's responses, possibly even controlled what I could and couldn't think. The being gestured towards the platform, and I sat down on the edge, my legs dangling over the side like a patient waiting in a doctor's office. The taller being I'd encountered in the observation chamber entered the room. It approached slowly, deliberately, and stopped about 3 feet in front of me. Up close, I could see details I'd missed before. The skin wasn't exactly gray. It had an almost translucent quality, like I was seeing through the outer layer to something beneath. The eyes weren't completely black as I'd first thought. There were subtle variations in shade, patterns that might have been pupils or irises, just so dark they were nearly invisible. It raised one hand, and I felt that familiar sensation of thoughts that weren't mine entering my consciousness. But this time the communication was more complex, more detailed. It was going to show me something, and it wanted me to understand that what it was about to reveal was a choice. They didn't typically do this. Humans were usually processed and returned or stored without ever gaining full awareness of what had happened. But occasionally, very rarely, they selected someone to carry the knowledge back. Someone who would remember, who would know the truth, and who would spend the rest of their life unable to do anything meaningful with that knowledge. I understood immediately that this was a form of psychological experimentation. They wanted to know what humans did with unbearable knowledge, how we coped, how it changed us, whether we broke under the weight of it, or found ways to adapt. I was going to be a data point in a study about human response to existential horror. The cruelty of it was almost elegant in its simplicity. The being touched my forehead with 2 fingers. The contact was cool, and I felt a jolt like mild electrical current pass through my skull. Then images began flowing into my mind. Not like memories, but like watching a documentary projected directly onto my consciousness. I saw the history of their interaction with Earth. They'd been coming here for at least 12,000 years, possibly longer. The first contacts happened when humans were still living in small hunter-gatherer bands. They'd taken people then too, but in much smaller numbers. Early humans had integrated these experiences into their religious and mythological frameworks. Beings from the sky, gods who descended and took people to other realms, fairy abductions, jinn who spirited people away. Every culture had stories about this, because every culture had experienced it. As human civilization developed, their operations expanded. They showed me specific instances spanning centuries. A Roman soldier, taken from a military camp in Germania, examined, and returned 3 days later with no memory of where he'd been. A Chinese peasant woman, taken from her village in the 12th century, kept in stasis for 2 years, while they studied the neural patterns associated with her religious experiences, then returned and labeled insane by her community when she tried to describe what had happened. A sailor taken from a merchant ship in the Caribbean, in 1743, examined, and thrown back into the ocean when they were finished, leading to his death by drowning and his disappearance being attributed to pirates or accident. The scale grew exponentially in the modern era, with global population reaching billions and humans spreading across every corner of the planet. Their harvesting operations increased proportionally. They showed me statistics, numbers that made my mind reel. Approximately 600,000 people reported missing in the United States every year. Most are found or return on their own. But roughly 4,400 remain missing long-term, their cases unsolved. The being made me understand that about 12% of those long-term disappearances, roughly 530 people per year in the US alone, were their operations. Multiply that across the entire planet, factor in countries with less robust missing persons databases, include remote areas where disappearances often go unreported, and the global number was staggering. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 humans taken annually. Not all were kept permanently. Most were examined and returned within hours or days, their memories suppressed, often experiencing the kind of missing time that Sarah and I had initially experienced. They'd wake up in their cars or homes or hotel rooms with hours they couldn't account for, sometimes with strange marks on their bodies, usually attributing it to getting drunk or having some kind of mental episode. The suppression wasn't perfect, hence the abduction accounts that people reported, the recovered memories under hypnosis, the persistent stories that mainstream science dismissed as sleep paralysis or fantasy. But it was effective enough that the phenomenon remained deniable, relegated to the fringe, never achieving the kind of mainstream acceptance that would trigger serious investigation. The being showed me their facility network. This ship I was on wasn't unique. There were 17 others operating in Earth's atmosphere and near orbital space, each one maintaining its own collection of humans in stasis. They rotated positions, covering different geographic regions, coordinating to ensure comprehensive coverage. The ships themselves were beyond anything human engineering could currently produce, not because the materials or principles were impossible for us to understand, but because the energy requirements and manufacturing precision were centuries beyond our current capabilities. Then it showed me what they did with what they harvested. This was harder to understand because the concepts didn't map cleanly onto human frames of reference. They extracted something from our consciousness, not our souls, that was too mystical a term, but the patterns of neural activity that constituted our self-awareness, our memories, our accumulated experiences. These patterns could be stored, analyzed, and apparently utilized in ways I couldn't fully grasp. The closest analogy I could form was like copying data from a computer, but that comparison was inadequate because what they were copying was the essence of lived experience, the subjective quality of having been a person. They used this harvested consciousness to enhance their own cognitive processes. Humans, despite our technological limitations, generated forms of consciousness they found valuable. Our creativity, our emotional range, our capacity for abstract reasoning and symbolic thought. By integrating patterns extracted from millions of human minds, they augmented their own intelligence in ways that were apparently difficult for their species to achieve organically. We were, in effect, cognitive supplements. Our subjective experiences were being harvested and repurposed to make them smarter, more capable, more effective at whatever their larger objectives were. The being showed me that this wasn't unique to Earth. They did this on other worlds, to other species that met certain criteria for consciousness complexity. Earth was one site in a much larger operation, spanning multiple star systems. We weren't special. We were just one more resource they'd discovered and learned to exploit. I felt sick, not just nauseous, though I was that too, but sick in a deeper way. The existential horror of understanding that humanity's relationship with these beings was fundamentally extractive. They'd been farming us for millennia, would continue farming us for as long as we existed, or as long as we remained useful, and there was absolutely nothing we could do about it. The technology gap was too vast. Even if I could somehow prove what was happening, even if I could make people believe me, what then? We had no defense against craft that could appear and disappear at will, that could paralyze human bodies with technology we couldn't detect, that could suppress and manipulate memories with precision. The being withdrew its fingers from my forehead, and the flow of information stopped. I sat there on the platform, processing what I'd been shown, feeling the weight of it settling into my mind like a physical substance. I understood why they were showing me this. They were curious about how I would handle it, whether I would break immediately or carry it for years, whether I'd try to warn others or keep silent, whether knowledge of my own cosmic insignificance would destroy my ability to function, or if I'd find some way to integrate it and continue living. I looked at the being and asked a question aloud, not sure if it could understand spoken language, but needing to voice it anyway. Why do you do this? If you're so advanced, why do you need to harvest consciousness from less developed species? Can't you generate what you need on your own? The response came as thoughts in my mind. They could generate consciousness, but not the specific varieties that biological species produced. Their own consciousness was different, more precise, more logical, less prone to the chaotic associations and emotional complexities that characterize biological minds. They tried to replicate human-style consciousness artificially and failed. The subjective qualities of lived biological experience couldn't be synthesized, only extracted from beings who had actually lived it. So they harvested it from species like us, species with the right kind of neural architecture and complexity. I asked another question. Do any of them ever escape? Has anyone ever gotten away and successfully exposed what you're doing? The response was immediate. No. The suppression protocols were too effective, the phenomenon too easily dismissed by mainstream institutions, the technology gap too insurmountable. A few humans throughout history had retained memories and tried to share what they'd experienced. But they'd been labeled insane, or their accounts had been folded into religious or mythological frameworks that defanged the truth. In the modern era, abduction accounts were treated as psychological phenomena, delusions or hoaxes. The scientific establishment wouldn't seriously investigate because the claims seemed too extraordinary, too contradictory to the accepted framework of reality. And even if someone could prove it, the being made me understand. What would change? Humans would panic. Governments would mobilize. But to what end? We couldn't shoot down their ships with current weapons technology. We couldn't prevent the abductions. We couldn't rescue the people being held in stasis. Revelation would only cause mass psychological trauma with no actionable solution. It was, from their perspective, more merciful to allow humanity to remain mostly ignorant. I felt rage building in my chest. Merciful? You think it's merciful to harvest people's consciousness without consent? To take them from their families, keep some of them locked in cylinders for years, and tell yourselves you're doing us a favor by keeping it secret? The being didn't respond to my anger. It simply conveyed that human concepts of consent and morality didn't apply to their relationship with us, any more than humans worried about the consent of cattle or laboratory mice. We operated under different ethical frameworks because we operated at different levels of complexity and capability. From their perspective, they were simply utilizing available resources in ways that served their needs. Our objections were noted but irrelevant. That was the moment I truly understood the hopelessness of the situation. I wasn't having a conversation with something that saw me as an equal. I was being explained to, the way you might explain something to a child or an animal, patiently, clearly, but with no expectation that my input would change anything about their behavior. I was an object of study, temporarily granted awareness, so they could observe my response. But I would never be a participant in any meaningful negotiation about humanity's relationship with them. The being gestured toward the opening that led to the observation chamber. It wanted me to go back there, to see something else. I stood up from the platform, my legs shaky, and walked through the opening. The room with its hundreds of cylinders stretched out before me, dimly lit. The faint hum of whatever technology maintained the stasis barely audible. This time, the being guided me to a specific section of cylinders, located in what I estimated was the center of the chamber. The people suspended here looked different from the others I'd seen. They weren't slack-faced and peaceful. Their expressions showed distress, eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids, muscles tense, faces contorted as if they were experiencing nightmares they couldn't wake from. The being made me understand that these were recent acquisitions, people taken within the last few months who were still being processed. The initial extraction of consciousness patterns was traumatic for the human nervous system, and it took time for the subjects to stabilize into the deeper stasis I'd seen in other parts of the chamber. Some never stabilized. Their neural architecture couldn't handle the extraction process, and they suffered permanent psychological damage. Those individuals were typically returned to Earth and often ended up in psychiatric facilities, diagnosed with schizophrenia or dissociative disorders. Their accounts of what happened to them dismissed as psychotic delusions. I moved closer to the first cylinder. Inside was a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and a small scar on her chin. Her eyes were moving behind closed lids, and her hands were clenched into fists. I recognized her immediately. Jessica Brennan, a graduate student from University of Montana who disappeared while on a field research trip in Glacier National Park 2 months ago. I'd seen her face on the news, heard her parents pleading for information about her whereabouts. Search and rescue had found her abandoned car and some of her equipment, but no trace of Jessica herself. The assumption was that she'd fallen into a ravine or been killed by wildlife, though no body had been recovered. I put my hand against the cylinder, feeling the warmth and vibration. She was alive in there, conscious on some level, experiencing whatever psychological horror the extraction process inflicted. And her parents had no idea. They were grieving her as dead or clinging to hope that she'd somehow survived in the wilderness and would be found. The truth, that she was suspended in alien technology, having her consciousness harvested, would never be considered because it was too far outside the boundaries of accepted reality. I moved to the next cylinder. The man inside was older, maybe late 50s, balding, with a distinctive tattoo of an eagle on his left shoulder. I knew him too, though not personally. Robert Dalton, a trucker who disappeared from a rest stop on I-90 in Idaho 6 weeks ago. His rig had been found with the keys still in the ignition, his wallet and phone on the seat, but no sign of Robert. Highway Patrol had investigated it as a possible abduction or foul play, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of a crime. The next cylinder held a teenager, 16 or 17, with braces and acne. I didn't recognize him immediately, but as I studied his face, I remembered a missing person poster I'd seen at a gas station in Montana. Michael something, I couldn't recall the last name, disappeared while riding his bike home from a friend's house 3 weeks ago. The community had organized search parties, distributed flyers, held vigils. His parents had appeared on the local news, begging for information. And here he was, suspended and being processed, while his family tore, themselves apart with grief and unanswered questions. The being directed my attention to a cylinder further down the row. Inside was a woman in her early 40s, athletic build, blonde hair in a braid. I recognized her instantly, and my stomach dropped. Amanda Price, a forest ranger from Olympic National Forest in Washington. I knew Amanda, not well, but we'd met at a safety seminar in Seattle about 3 years ago. We talked over coffee during a break, exchanged contact information, stayed in occasional touch via email. She'd sent me a message 4 months ago about a backpacking trip she was planning. I'd meant to respond and never had, figuring I'd get to it later. She'd been reported missing 7 weeks ago. I'd seen the news coverage. She'd been on a solo patrol and never checked in at the end of her shift. Her vehicle was found parked at a trailhead, her radio and supplies still inside, but Amanda was gone. The search effort had been massive. Forest Service personnel, volunteers, search and rescue teams, helicopters with thermal imaging, nothing. After 2 weeks, they'd scaled down the operation, and after a month, they'd officially concluded that she'd likely fallen into a ravine or been killed by wildlife, though the lack of any physical evidence made that conclusion uncertain. I stared at her face through the transparent cylinder. She looked like she was screaming, though no sound came out. Her features were twisted in an expression of absolute terror. I wondered what she was experiencing in there, what nightmares the extraction process was forcing her to endure. Amanda was a professional, trained for wilderness emergencies, competent and careful. She would have fought if given the chance. She would have tried to escape or signal for help, but none of that had mattered. They'd taken her anyway, and now she was here, being harvested, while the official investigation into her disappearance grew cold. The being made me understand something else. The people in these cylinders weren't here randomly. They'd been specifically selected based on certain characteristics, neural patterns that made their consciousness particularly valuable for harvesting, personality traits that generated the kinds of experiences the beings found useful, genetic markers that correlated with desirable forms of cognition. The selection process was sophisticated, targeting individuals whose disappearance would be investigated but ultimately accepted as unsolved. People who lived alone or traveled frequently. People in professions that involved isolated work in remote areas. People whose vanishing could be attributed to accidents or voluntary disappearance without stretching credibility too far. They avoided taking people whose disappearance would trigger massive sustained attention. Celebrities, politicians, anyone with enough public visibility that their case would remain in the news cycle for years. They avoided taking children from populated areas because those cases generated too much emotional response and investigative pressure. They'd refined their selection criteria over centuries to minimize the risk of exposure while maximizing the quality and quantity of consciousness they could harvest. I moved through the section, looking at face after face. Some I recognized from news reports or missing person databases. Others were strangers, but each one was a person with a life and family and hopes that had been interrupted by this nightmare. I counted 23 people in this particular section, all taken within the last 3 months, all being processed, all experiencing whatever psychological trauma the extraction process inflicted. The being showed me something else then, a projection of some kind, images appearing in the air in front of me. Security camera footage, I realized. It was showing me how some of these people had been taken. I watched Jessica Brennan walking along a forest trail, camera equipment hanging from her shoulder taking photographs of wildflowers. She stopped to adjust her lens, and the footage showed a bright light descending from above, though the trees mostly obscured it. Jessica looked up, her expression changing from curiosity to confusion to fear in the space of seconds. Then the light intensified and she simply rose off the ground, her body lifting smoothly upward as if gravity had reversed. The footage cut off as she disappeared into the canopy. The next clip showed Robert Dalton at the rest stop, standing outside his truck, stretching his back after hours of driving. The lot was empty except for his rig. He walked toward the bathroom facility, and halfway there he stopped, looking up at something the camera angle didn't capture. He raised his hand to shield his eyes from a bright light, then stumbled backward, his legs giving out. He collapsed to his knees, and then the same levitation effect, his body rising smoothly into the air and disappearing upward out of frame. Amanda's footage was harder to watch. It showed her walking along a forest trail, radio in hand, conducting what looked like a routine patrol. She paused to examine something off the trail, probably animal tracks or trail damage. Then she turned, looking back the way she'd come, her body language shifting to alert tension. She raised her radio, but before she could speak into it, she went rigid, every muscle locking. The radio fell from her hand. She stood there, completely immobile, for maybe 10 seconds. Then she began rising into the air, her body still frozen in that standing position. The footage showed her ascending through the trees until she was out of view. The being made me understand that the paralysis was induced remotely, a targeted effect on the human nervous system that shut down voluntary motor control while leaving autonomic functions intact. Victims remained conscious but unable to move or call for help. By the time the paralysis wore off, they were already aboard the ship, and the suppression protocols were being applied to ensure they wouldn't remember the experience clearly. I turned away from the projections, unable to watch more. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked aloud. "What do you want from me?" The response came as thoughts, observation, and documentation. I was going to be returned to Earth with my memories intact. They wanted to monitor how I processed the knowledge, how it affected my behavior and psychology over years or decades. Would I try to tell others? Would I attempt to warn potential victims? Would I break under the weight of knowing? Would I find ways to rationalize or compartmentalize? They were curious about long-term human response to unbearable knowledge, and I was going to be their case study. And if I do tell people, if I go public with everything you've shown me? The being conveyed calm certainty. No one would believe me. I had no physical evidence, no way to prove any of it. At best, I'd be labeled a conspiracy theorist or someone suffering from delusions. At worst, I'd be institutionalized. My career as a pilot was likely already over due to the missing time incident. Adding claims of alien abduction would only ensure I'd never be trusted with an aircraft again. I could tell my story, write about it, even go on television if I wanted, but it would accomplish nothing except damaging my own credibility and relationships. The being showed me one more thing then, a final image that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a projection of Earth from space, but overlaid with data markers showing the locations of their operations over the last year. Thousands of points of light scattered across every continent, clustered more heavily in areas with large populations, but present even in the most remote regions. Each light represented a harvest operation, a person taken. The scale was staggering, and this was just 1 year. Multiply it by centuries, by millennia, and the number of humans who'd been taken, processed, and either returned or kept became almost incomprehensible. We'd been harvested throughout our entire history as a species, and we'd never realized it, never developed an effective defense, never even achieved mainstream scientific acknowledgement that it was happening. The being led me back to the examination room. I felt numb, overwhelmed by everything I'd seen and been shown. My mind was struggling to process it all, to find some framework that could contain the horror of what humanity's real relationship with these beings actually was. We weren't being studied with scientific detachment. We weren't being prepared for eventual contact and integration into some galactic community. We were being farmed, harvested for our consciousness, with no more consideration for our autonomy or well-being than we gave to the animals we raised for food. Another being entered the room, different from the others. This one was taller, maybe 6 feet, with a different body proportion, less fragile-looking, more solid. The skin tone was different too, more bronze than gray. It approached me, and I felt the now familiar sensation of thoughts entering my mind, but the quality of communication was different, more complex, more nuanced, carrying subtleties that the smaller being's communication hadn't conveyed. This being held authority. It was responsible for operations on this ship, a coordinator or manager of some kind. And it was going to offer me a choice, though I understood immediately that both options were designed to serve their interests, not mine. There was no third option where I went free with my memories intact and somehow found a way to fight back or rescue the people in those cylinders. That wasn't on the table. The first option was complete memory suppression. They would erase everything from the moment I'd seen the light outside my cockpit window to the moment they returned me to my aircraft. I'd wake up on the ground in Great Falls with no clear memory of what happened during those hours, just like Sarah. I'd experience some fragmentary dreams maybe, vague impressions, but nothing coherent enough to constitute actual knowledge of what I'd experienced. I could go back to my life, continue my career as a pilot, maintain my relationships and peace of mind. The uncertainty would be uncomfortable, but I'd eventually rationalize it as some kind of medical event or instrument malfunction, and I'd move on. The second option was selective memory retention. They would allow me to keep the memories of what I'd seen and been shown, but they would adjust certain emotional responses and cognitive patterns to ensure I could function. Without these adjustments, the being made me understand, the psychological weight of the knowledge would likely drive me to suicide or complete psychological breakdown within months. Humans weren't equipped to handle existential horror of this magnitude without support structures. And I couldn't get support because no one would believe me. So they'd make small modifications, dampening the acute anxiety responses, preventing obsessive rumination from completely taking over my cognitive function, allowing me to compartmentalize enough that I could still engage with normal daily life. I'd remember everything, but I'd be able to live with remembering. And they'd monitor me, periodically checking in somehow, observing how the knowledge shaped my choices and behavior over time. I'd be a long-term case study in human response to confirmed cosmic insignificance and powerlessness. I asked the obvious question: why would I choose to remember? Why wouldn't I just take the suppression and go back to not knowing? The response was interesting. The being suggested that humans often chose knowledge over comfort, even when the knowledge was painful. We valued truth, valued understanding our reality, even when that reality was harsh. Some part of me wanted to know, wanted to understand what had happened to me and what was happening to others. The being was offering me that understanding, with the caveat that I'd have to live with it for the rest of my life, unable to do anything meaningful to change the situation. It was a psychological experiment, disguised as a choice. They wanted to see what I'd decide, wanted to observe how I'd handle the consequences either way. If I chose suppression, they'd study how I processed the fragmentary memories and missing time. If I chose retention, they'd study how I lived with unbearable knowledge. Either way, I was serving their research interests. I thought about Amanda Price in that cylinder, her face frozen in a silent scream. I thought about Jessica Brennan and Robert Dalton and the teenager with braces and all the others I'd seen. If I chose suppression, I'd forget them. They'd become abstract statistics, missing people I might see on the news but have no personal connection to. I wouldn't wake up at night thinking about their faces, wouldn't carry the weight of knowing what had really happened to them. But I'd also lose the truth. I'd lose the understanding of what was really happening to humanity, the knowledge of our actual place in the cosmos. I'd go back to the comfortable delusion that we were alone in the universe, or that if we weren't alone, contact would happen on our terms, through official channels, with dignity and choice. I'd lose the terrible clarity I'd gained about our true situation. I asked how long I had to decide. The being conveyed that I needed to choose now, immediately. They were preparing to return me to my aircraft, and the memory protocols had to be applied before that happened. Whatever I decided in this moment would determine how I experienced the rest of my life. I stood there in that sterile white room, under that sourceless light, facing a choice between ignorance and unbearable knowledge. Part of me wanted desperately to choose suppression, to let them erase what I'd seen, to go back to my comfortable life and never know this horror existed. But another part, maybe the part that had made me want to be a pilot in the first place, the part that was drawn to seeing things from new perspectives and understanding systems beyond the ordinary, couldn't accept forgetting. If I forgot, then what happened to me would be wasted. I'd be just another statistic, another person processed and returned, contributing to the research without even knowing it. But if I remembered, if I carried this knowledge, then at least one human being would know the truth. Even if I couldn't prove it, even if no one believed me, even if I couldn't rescue anyone or stop the harvesting, I would know. The truth would exist in at least one human consciousness, and that felt important in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I made my decision. I want to remember all of it, everything you've shown me. The being conveyed something that felt like satisfaction mixed with curiosity. It had expected this choice, I realized. They'd profiled me before taking me, understood my personality structure, predicted that I would choose knowledge over comfort. This whole scenario had been engineered with the expectation that I'd make exactly this choice, which meant the real experiment was seeing what I'd do with the knowledge over the following decades. The being approached and placed its hand on my forehead. I felt a sensation like cold electricity spreading through my brain, not painful, but deeply uncomfortable. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, and when the being withdrew its hand, something felt different. The horror and despair I'd been feeling were still there, but they weren't as acute, weren't as overwhelming. I could think about what I'd learned without feeling like I was drowning in it. The modifications they'd made were subtle, but I could sense them working, creating just enough psychological buffer that I could function while still carrying the full weight of the knowledge. The being conveyed final information. I would be returned to my aircraft shortly. Sarah would remain under full suppression. They saw no research value in allowing her to remember. The official investigation into our missing time would find no definitive explanation. My career as a commercial pilot would likely end, though that would be my choice based on how I chose to handle the aftermath. They would monitor me periodically, though I wouldn't necessarily be aware of when it was happening. And if I ever chose to tell my story publicly, they wouldn't interfere. They wouldn't silence me or take me again, or punish me in any way. I was free to share what I knew, with the full understanding that doing so would accomplish nothing except potentially destroying my credibility and relationships. The truth would remain safely hidden behind the wall of its own implausibility. The being touched my forehead one more time, and I felt a wave of drowsiness wash over me. My vision began to blur, and I felt myself falling backward, but I never hit the ground. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was that sterile white room, and the beings watching me with their dark, unreadable eyes. I woke up in the cockpit with my hands on the yoke and Great Falls Tower, asking if we were experiencing an emergency. The rest happened exactly as I've already described. The confusion, the interviews, the medical exams, the investigation. But unlike Sarah, I remembered everything. Every detail of those 6 hours aboard the ship was crystal clear in my mind, protected by whatever modifications they'd made to ensure I could carry the knowledge without breaking. The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up from nightmares about the observation chamber, about Amanda's face frozen in that silent scream, about the thousands of lights on the Earth projection showing where they were harvesting people. The modifications they'd made kept me functional, but they couldn't eliminate the grief and horror completely. I just had to learn to live with it. The FAA investigation concluded after 6 weeks. The flight data recorder showed a gap in the data corresponding to our missing time. Just blank space where there should have been altitude, airspeed, heading, and engine parameters. The cockpit voice recorder showed the same gap. 3 hours of nothing, as if the recorders had simply stopped functioning. The investigators concluded probable electrical malfunction of unknown origin. They couldn't explain how we'd ended up in Great Falls or who had landed the aircraft. The working theory was that I'd experienced some kind of dissociative episode, landed the plane while in an altered state of consciousness, and then had no memory of doing so. They didn't revoke my license, but they mandated a psychological evaluation and a medical assessment before I could return to commercial flying. I saw the therapist they assigned, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, who specialized in trauma. I told her about stress, about nightmares, about feeling disconnected from my work. I didn't tell her about the ship or the beings or the harvesting. I knew exactly what would happen if I did. Immediate psychiatric hold, possible commitment, definite end to any chance of flying again. After 3 sessions, Dr. Morrison cleared me to return to work, noting that I'd experienced a stress-related dissociative episode that appeared to be resolving with support. Western Pacific Airlines offered me my position back, but I declined. I told them I needed more time, that I wasn't ready. The truth was that I couldn't imagine going back to flying commercial routes, maintaining the pretense of normal life, when I knew what was really happening above our heads. When I knew that on any given night, thousands of people were being harvested, and no one in positions of authority had any idea it was occurring. I took early retirement at 36 years old. Linda didn't understand, and I couldn't explain it to her in any way that made sense. I told her I'd lost my nerve after the incident, that I didn't trust myself in a cockpit anymore. She accepted this, though I could see the confusion and disappointment in her eyes. Our relationship changed after that. I was different, and she knew it, but she didn't know why. I'd become someone who woke up screaming, who spent hours staring at missing person databases on the internet, who couldn't watch the news without feeling sick when reports of unexplained disappearances came on. We stayed together for 8 more years, but the marriage was hollow. I was present physically, but absent in every other way. In 2009, she asked for a divorce, and I didn't fight it. My daughters were adults by then, living their own lives. They sided with their mother, seeing me as the one who'd broken the family by withdrawing. They weren't wrong. I had withdrawn. I'd pulled away from everyone because how could I maintain normal relationships when I was carrying this knowledge? I moved to a small town in Montana, bought a house with the money from the divorce settlement and my early retirement savings, and spent the next decade trying to figure out what to do with what I knew. I created spreadsheets tracking missing persons cases, looking for patterns that might indicate harvesting operations. I found them: clusters of disappearances in certain geographic areas, demographic patterns in who was taken, temporal patterns in when abductions occurred. None of it was proof, just statistical anomalies that could be explained by other factors. I tried writing about my experience once, in 2012. I posted it on an internet forum dedicated to UFO encounters and alien abductions. The responses ranged from supportive to skeptical to openly mocking. A few people claimed to believe me, but they were mostly true believers who believed every alien story they encountered. No one who mattered paid attention. The post was eventually buried under thousands of other similar accounts. Just one more unprovable story in an ocean of unprovable stories. I attended a UFO conference in 2015, thinking maybe I could connect with researchers who were seriously investigating the phenomenon. What I found instead was a mixture of genuine investigators hamstrung by lack of credible evidence and opportunists selling books and videos. I sat through presentations about lights in the sky, about possible government cover-ups, about the need for official disclosure. None of them understood what I knew. That disclosure wouldn't come because the beings didn't care if we knew or not, that we had no leverage to demand anything, that the harvesting would continue whether we acknowledged it or not. I tried going to the media once, in 2018. I contacted a journalist who'd written sympathetically about UFO phenomena, who seemed to take the subject seriously. We met for coffee, and I told him a condensed version of my story. He listened politely, took notes, asked good questions. Then he asked for evidence, physical proof, documents, anything that could corroborate my account. I had nothing except my testimony and my memory. He told me he appreciated me sharing, but that without evidence, he couldn't run a story. No credible news organization would publish an uncorroborated alien abduction account from a former pilot who'd had a psychological episode. He was right, of course. I had no evidence because they'd made sure I had no evidence. The modifications they'd made to my memory ensured perfect recall of the experience, but provided nothing tangible I could show others. I was exactly what they'd intended me to be, a bearer of truth that couldn't be proven, carrying knowledge that would never be accepted. So I stopped trying to convince anyone. I moved through my days quietly, maintaining minimal social contact, checking missing persons databases compulsively, and living with the weight of knowing what was happening to people while the world continued in ignorance. The modifications they'd made kept me functional enough to grocery shop and pay bills and maintain my house. But I wasn't really living. I was just existing, waiting for whatever they were going to observe next in their long-term study of how I coped. Then, 2 months ago, something changed. I was checking the Montana Missing Persons database, something I did almost daily, when I saw a face that made my heart stop. Amanda Price. Not a current missing person, but a cold case update. Her body had been found by hikers in Olympic National Forest 23 years after her disappearance. Advanced decomposition made it difficult to determine cause of death, but the coroner's report listed probable accidental death, possibly from a fall. I knew immediately what had happened. They'd returned her body after harvesting what they needed from her consciousness. They'd probably done it years ago, placing her remains somewhere they'd eventually be found, ensuring the case got closure and moved out of the missing persons database and into the solved category. One more statistic, one more tragic accident in the wilderness, one more family that could finally have a funeral and move on. But I'd seen Amanda alive in that cylinder 23 years ago. I'd seen her face frozen in a silent scream while they extracted her consciousness. And now she was being buried, her death officially attributed to natural causes or accident, while the truth of what had been done to her would die with me. That's when I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not because I think telling this story will change anything. I know it won't. The harvesting will continue. People will keep disappearing. The beings will keep operating with impunity. But Amanda deserves to have someone who knows the truth speak it, even if no one believes it. Jessica Brennan and Robert Dalton and Michael and all the others in those cylinders deserve to have their real fate acknowledged by at least one person, even if that acknowledgement remains unproven and unaccepted. I'm 58 years old now, and I know this testimony will likely be dismissed or ignored. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not trying to prove what happened. I'm simply stating, for the record, what I experienced and what I learned during those 6 hours aboard that ship in November 2001. This is my testimony, and it's all I have to offer. Since Amanda's body was found, I've noticed something. The monitoring has increased. I feel it sometimes. Brief moments of disorientation, gaps in time that last only seconds or minutes, but that I recognize as their check-ins. They're watching to see how I respond to this final piece of the pattern, to see if finding out that they returned Amanda's body will break me or change my behavior. I'm still part of their experiment, still generating data for their study of human psychology. I've made peace with this, as much as anyone can make peace with being a permanent research subject. The modifications they made ensure I can function, can get through my days without collapsing under the weight of what I know. But those modifications don't eliminate the knowledge itself or the moral responsibility I feel to speak it. Here's what I want people to understand, even if they don't believe the specifics of my account. Thousands of people disappear every year under circumstances that are never fully explained. Hikers who vanish from well-traveled trails, travelers who disappear from rest stops, people who leave their homes and are never seen again. The vast majority of these cases have conventional explanations: accidents, crimes, voluntary disappearance, mental health crises. But a percentage of them don't fit those patterns. They're the cases where experienced outdoors people disappeared in good weather with no trace, where vehicles are found with keys in the ignition and no signs of struggle, where the person simply ceases to exist with no logical explanation. We tell ourselves comfortable stories about these cases. We assume accident even when no body is found. We assume crime even when there's no evidence of foul play. We assume voluntary disappearance even when it contradicts everything we know about the person's character and circumstances. We do this because the alternative, that something is taking people for purposes we can't understand or defend against, is too disturbing to accept. I'm telling you that the alternative is real. Something is taking people. They've been doing it throughout human history. They'll continue doing it for as long as they find us useful. And we have no effective defense because the technology gap is too vast, and our institutions are too invested in conventional frameworks of reality to seriously investigate the phenomenon. I don't know if my speaking out will help anyone. I don't know if any potential victims could use this information to protect themselves. Probably not, since the beings select targets based on criteria. We don't fully understand and use methods we can't detect or resist. But I needed to say it. I needed Amanda and Jessica and Robert and Michael and all the others to have at least one person who knows what really happened to them, who can speak their names and acknowledge the truth of their fate. To the families of missing persons whose cases remain unsolved, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I can't prove what I'm telling you. I'm sorry that I can't give you the closure you deserve or help you recover your loved ones. I'm sorry that the truth is so far outside accepted reality that it will never be officially acknowledged or investigated with the seriousness it deserves. All I can offer is this testimony, this statement that some of those missing people aren't lost to conventional explanations. They were taken, they were harvested, and some of them are still being held in conditions we can barely comprehend. To the beings conducting these operations, if you're monitoring this, as I suspect you are, I want you to know that I understand the futility of what I'm doing. I know this testimony will change nothing about your activities. I know humanity lacks the capability to stop you or even prove you exist. I know I'm exactly what you designed me to be, a carrier of unbearable knowledge that serves your research interest whether I speak or stay silent. But I choose to speak anyway, because that's what humans do. We tell the truth even when it costs us everything, even when no one believes us, even when we know it won't change the outcome. It's the one form of resistance available to us, and I'm exercising it. I don't expect this account to go viral or spark a major investigation. I expect it will be filed alongside thousands of other alien abduction stories, indistinguishable from the hoaxes and delusions and misidentifications. That's fine. I'm not trying to start a movement or convince the world. I'm just creating a record, a statement of truth that exists independent of whether anyone accepts it. If you're reading this and you think I'm delusional or lying or suffering from false memories, I understand. I wouldn't have believed it either before it happened to me. But consider this. What if even one of these thousands of unexplained disappearances each year has a non-conventional explanation? What if just 1% of missing persons cases involve something beyond crime or accident? That would still be hundreds of people annually being taken for purposes we don't understand. Doesn't that possibility deserve serious investigation, even if it challenges our comfortable assumptions about reality? I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that our understanding of what's happening on this planet is incomplete, that there are forces operating beyond our control or comprehension, that some of the people who vanish aren't lost to conventional explanations, but to something much stranger and more systematic. And if you're someone who's experienced missing time, who has fragmentary memories of being taken, who wakes up with unexplained marks and a sense that something happened to you that you can't quite remember, know that you're not crazy. The suppression protocols aren't perfect. Some memories leak through. What you're experiencing might be real, and you deserve to have that possibility acknowledged, even if you can never prove it. I've lived with this knowledge for 23 years. It's shaped every day of my life since November 2001. It cost me my career, my marriage, my relationship with my daughters, and any hope of returning to normal life. But I don't regret choosing to remember. The truth, even terrible truth, feels more valuable to me than comfortable ignorance. Maybe that's irrational. Maybe I would have been happier if I'd chosen suppression, but I chose knowledge, and I've carried it, and now I'm sharing it with whoever is willing to listen. This is my testimony. My name is David Castellano. I was a commercial pilot who experienced 6 hours aboard an alien vessel in November 2001. What I learned during those hours is that humanity is being systematically harvested for our consciousness, that this has been happening for thousands of years, and that we have no effective defense against it. The beings conducting these operations don't see us as equals, or even as sentient beings worthy of consent. We're resources to them, nothing more. I know what they do to people on those ships. I've seen it. I've experienced it. And I'll carry that knowledge until the day I die, which is exactly what they intended when they gave me the choice to remember. I'm their long-term experiment in human psychology, their case study in how we cope with cosmic insignificance and powerlessness. But even as their experiment, even as someone carrying knowledge I can never prove, I have this, the ability to speak the truth. They can harvest our consciousness, can take our bodies, can suppress our memories, but they can't eliminate the human drive to testify, to witness, to speak what we know, even when speaking accomplishes nothing concrete. This is my act of resistance, futile as it may be. This is me saying that we exist, that we matter, that what happens to us deserves to be acknowledged, even if we're powerless to stop it. The harvesting continues. People keep disappearing. The beings keep operating with impunity. And I keep living with the knowledge, doing the only thing available to me, telling the truth to whoever will listen, knowing most won't believe it, knowing it won't change anything, but telling it anyway because it needs to be said. This is what I know. This is what happened to me. This is the truth about what they do to people on those ships. And whether you believe me or not, it remains true. The harvesting is real. The beings are real. And humanity's actual relationship with them is nothing like what we imagine when we dream about first contact. I'm sorry I can't offer you comfort or hope. I'm sorry the truth is this dark, but it's the truth, and I've carried it long enough in silence. Now it's yours to do with as you will. Believe it, dismiss it, ignore it. The choice is yours. But at least now one more person has heard it, and maybe that matters, even if only in some small, symbolic way. My name is David Castellano. I'm 58 years old, and this is what I know about what aliens do to people on their ships. The truth is exactly as horrifying as you feared it might be.